Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of No More Silos. My name is Dr. Erica Santiago and this is my podcast. Hey everybody, welcome. 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 It is fall, y'all, in the South. I just checked and it's 60 degrees here in Atlanta right now, and it's the middle of the day. And I have the house to myself, so I'm recording again. Yay! Yay for you guys. It is, and yay for me, because I enjoy having these conversations with you all. Here on No More Silos, we talk about where do our ideas come from. And I like to connect the dots. I mean, that's the whole point of saying no more silos, right? That there are things that have happened or are happening in our world, our culture, our communities today, in our churches today. We don't know where they came from. We don't know where the ideas came from. And here I like to look at history. I had someone point out the other day that if there's something that's related tangentially even to church history, I probably know about it and can speak at length. And there was a point in time where I used to be able to speak at length about the Crusades because that was actually probably part of my foray into Christian history. I would say yes, that was definitely how I got into, as just something, an interest into learning about Christian history. It was the Crusades, because I was trying to figure out why everybody else hates us. Like, why are people upset with Christians? What did we do to deserve this? And then I realized, oh, we did a lot. In our last episode, we talked about discipleship as a group project, the last couple of episodes, in fact. And we talked about discipleship as a group project, and we've been talking about identity and who we are or who we think we are. Jesus asked the question in Matthew 16, I think it is. Jesus asked the question of his disciples, who do people say that I am? And I'm asking the question today, asking ourselves, who are we? Who am I when I say I'm a Christian? Who am I when I say I am a disciple, a follower of Jesus? What does that mean, a follower of the way? And in today's episode, I want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount because, there's that book that I'd love for you to buy that's sitting on Amazon right now waiting just for you. Or you could, if you've already bought that one, check out Women Who Follow Jesus. But in all seriousness, the Bible study on Sermon on the Mount has led me to kind of reflecting on that in the context of the Bible study I'm currently conducting at our church on the book of Revelation. A vision for discipleship. Who am I? What does it mean to be a Christian? Jesus answers this question in John's gospel with the 7 I am statements. He says, who I am, I am. And God says this to Moses with the burning bush. He just says, I am. And if, as you're listening to this, it might be full-on holiday season and the end of the year, and everybody's reflecting on what has happened in 2024, both from a big picture scenario, but also a micro scenario in that, your life, my life. How has my year been? Or you're trying to think of how to do things differently in 2025 or what's coming up. And so as we're thinking about this, I want us to kind of look at it in the context of rediscovering our identity from cultural Christianity to Christ-centered discipleship. Rediscovering identity from cultural Christianity to Christ-centered discipleship. That's the vision I have for discipleship. And I have many books on my shelves, and the one on the Crusades, I kept walking past it on the shelf, and then since we were talking about the last apocalypse in 1000 AD in the previous episode, I was curious about when the Crusades began. When did the Crusades begin? And on page 2 of this, I guess it's basically a textbook on the Crusades reference book, it says, a definition of crusading that confined it to one theater, the Near East, and one period of history, the years from 1097 to 1291, was formulated by the English historian Thomas Fuller in 1639. And the author here names the book that Thomas Fuller wrote. But the author of this book on the Crusades, History of Crusades, says, in placing authentic crusading in a distant past, Fuller was being arbitrary and inconsistent. It was difficult for him to ignore the warfare between Christians and Turks that was raging in the Mediterranean as he wrote. Remember, 1639. What else was being written in 1611? The King James translation. 1619, the settlement of Jamestown. 1620, Plymouth Rock and the Puritans that get kicked out of Europe because, well, that's a story for another day. But in placing this authentic crusading in a distant past, Fuller was being arbitrary and inconsistent. It was difficult for him to ignore the warfare between Christians and Turks that was raging in the Mediterranean as he wrote in 1639, and he recognized that the Knights Hospitaller, in their order state of Malta, were actively engaged. Indeed, they were to join a crusade league that was formed to defend Crete within 6 years of the publication of his book. He did not, in fact, entirely dismiss the possibility that crusades would be fought in the future, and he even conceived of the launching of a new one to recover Jerusalem, although he considered that it would be totally impractical. It is not surprising that his definition was not generally accepted at the time, 1639. And Louis Maimberg, who wrote in 1675, knew that the theater of war had changed to European soil. Another author in 1672 put forward an ambitious project to conquer Egypt in a war, although this plan involved the use of the state armies of France. And so traditionalism was established by the leaders of the 18th century Enlightenment. You know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the impact of the Enlightenment philosophers on Christianity in many of his texts that are often not the ones quoted on MLK Day, but he did talk about it quite a bit because, you know, Dr. King's PhD was in theology and he was well versed in philosophy. And so the Enlightenment folks adopted the same approach as Fuller. Denis Diderot, who also discussed campaigns against heretics and in the Baltic in his encyclopedia in 1751 through 1772, or Voltaire in 1756, or David Hume in his History of England in 1762, or William Robertson, who added another element when he stressed the cultural superiority of the Muslims in the progress of society in Europe in 1769, and Edward Gibbon in the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, confined crusading to the East and to the Central Middle Ages. So we have these folks who just went through what was the non-apocalypse apocalypse in 1000 AD. Within 100 years, they're really going at it with this Christendom thing. And that was the Crusades, trying to overtake the Holy Lands, or what they perceived were the Holy Lands, and was this perception of, I need to fight for Jesus because he needs me to go beat people upside the head to get them to follow him because the infidels are there, the heretics are there. When in fact, maybe they were the heretics and the infidels. I'm just saying. And although there can be no doubt that if one puts to one side the propagandists for the Hospitallers on Malta, such as René de Vertot in his History of Chevalier Hospitallers and in 1726, the consensus in advanced intellectual circles was that the crusading movement was long dead and therefore past history. And although some writers recognized that he had brought benefits to Europe, or that it had brought benefits to Europe, it remained, the Crusades, it remained a prime example of medieval superstition and folly. Why does everybody in the world hate Christians? Because of medieval superstition and folly. And it can't be stressed enough that these thinkers were employing an arbitrary definition that enabled them to condemn the movement as an example of medieval foolishness while throwing a blanket over its most recent manifestations. In other words, it was still going on. When I tell you I've got this book on Crusades, it's fairly thick. Um, in fact, I'm using my knees to help prop it up and hold it up because it's kind of heavy as I am reading. Still on page 2, talking about traditionalism. Diderot, for example, could not avoid referring in his encyclopedia to the island of Malta as a center of war against the enemies of the Christian name, but in a long article on the Knights Hospitaller, hardly made reference to warfare after 1291. Although a great deal of space was given to their order's structure and constitution, the approach of the Enlightenment thinkers was, however, followed by a serious scholar, Friedrich Wilken, who had the advantage of knowing Arabic and Persian. You see, when history is written, it's written by the person that won. It's written by the conquerors, and it's written in their language. And so one of the challenges that we have today is that we don't know biblical Hebrew and we don't know biblical Greek. And so where some ideas are lost to us and we are at the disadvantage of having to rely just on the translations that have been passed down to us. Even though we can access the biblical Greek and Hebrew, and up until well into the 19th century, it was fairly common that it was included in your basic education if you were educated in the Western world, that you would learn Greek and Hebrew and Latin. So this guy, Friedrich, in 1832, had the advantage of also being able to read Arabic and Persian. Why is it so important that to be able to read Arabic? Because the Quran was written in Arabic, and it is the same Arabic that people are taught. If you follow Islam as your faith, you're taught to be able to read the Quran in Arabic. They don't rely on English translations. Like, that's frowned upon. But over here in Western Christianity, we're like, we'll just take the ESV at face value, even though we know that it's written from a very patriarchal, or translated from a very patriarchal perspective, filter, framework. So anyway, this guy Wilken, Friedrich Wilken, had the advantage of knowing Arabic and Persian. He writes 7 volumes between 1807 and 1832, and he's regarded in academic circles as a model of text-based scholarship and objectivity. And about the same time, the Enlightenment viewpoint is popularized by Sir Walter Scott, whose writing was to be much more influential than it deserved to be, according to this author. 4 of Scott's novels involved Crusades and Crusaders in the early 1800s. And in fact, one of them is set in Palestine and centered on a friendship between a Scottish knight and Saladin, who appeared in a bewildering array of disguises, including that of a skilled physician who cured King Richard of England. I mean, there's like all of these novels show up during the Enlightenment period, fan fiction, right, about the Crusades. In fact, we continue to have movies and series and TV shows based in that time period because it's so interesting. But let me jump to the end of the book on the Crusades, this history. Because all of you I know that listen here are not necessarily as interested in the minutiae of history and the 200, possibly much longer period of the Crusades. But it says here, and this is how he ends this history. The history of the Crusades is full of surprises. One of them is the speed with which the last remnants of the movement were finally eliminated. Crusading had appealed to everyone, but its decline had been extraordinarily slow. Even the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had not killed it off, nor had the generally successful challenges described in the first chapter of this book to the premises for holy war, of divine authority and the moral neutrality of violence, because, the Crusades is where we have these holy wars because of a misreading of the Old Testament, thinking that we needed to go and fight for God. God needed us to go out there and obliterate the people who did not believe instead of loving them, but fighting them. And on the basis of this divine authority that was encapsulated in the office of the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. You don't see any other institutions of Christianity going around starting wars. Just Roman Catholics. Just them. And so it reaches this terminal stage, we think, in the 1200s, because that's the history we've been given. But actually, it was 1890s. They were still fighting. And some of these skirmishes, these wars, these small battles, that the way that it's come down to us in 2024 um, shows up leading to World War I and World War II, shows up in the war in Ukraine today, shows up in the wars that have that continue in Africa, on the continent of Africa. Um, there is there was a removal, if I could say it that way, from the collective memory. So how does one go about wiping the collective memory in history? How does one do that? I mean, within half a century, the Crusades are rejected so completely, these divine wars, so to speak, that recent examples of it were consigned to oblivion. So this guy in the 1600s is telling people, oh, the Crusades were 500 years ago, 400 years ago. We don't do that anymore. When in fact it was still going on. 2 world wars, human suffering on a scale that people just couldn't fathom. An intellectual consensus confined the idea of the Crusades to the Middle Ages, and the word crusade remains in use, but it's in a debased form, implying for most people nothing more than some heartfelt campaign of a political or religious cause. This is how language changes over time. And the Western culture has found a replacement for holy war in secular forms of ideological violence employed on behalf of religious or cultural or even pseudoscientific ideals, like nationalism, Marxism, fascism, and even even humanitarianism, that were or are considered by their adherents to be of universal importance. And it is indicative that the South American militants of the Christian liberation in the 1960s do not seem to have recognized how close their ideas were to their Iberian predecessors, although elements of in their theology, the use of force in the names of Christ and fraternal charity and a belief in martyrdom and battle would have classed them as para-crusaders. We ask questions about why are people leaving South America and coming here. The roots of all of that go back way farther than a few administrations, go back way farther than just American politics. The men who were inspired to make profession as crusaders, or the people who were the last crusaders, like, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Here we have archaeologists. Do you know, or do you realize a lot of archaeology gets its significance, or its start, I should say, from the idea that they were looking for the Holy Grail or looking for proof that Jesus existed, because in the age of enlightenment, when rationalism prevailed, people were looking for a logical answer to what was symbolic and allegorical in the text of the Bible. The history was lost in a lot of ways. One, because you may not have had people who could read the Arabic, where the history was recorded, or the Persian, or the Greek, or even the Latin. So here on No More Silos, I'm thinking through some of this history, and I'm like, it is so, looking at it through the lens of today, and looking at it through the lens of cultural versus Christ-centered Christian identity. Look what this cultural Christian identity did with the Crusades. And so this movement, the Crusades, was finally dispatched in the 20th century, not because it was impractical, which it certainly was, but because it was wiped from the collective memory. How do we wipe things from our collective memory? This is why we don't understand Revelation. The people who received the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, initially, they identified culturally as Jews, or maybe they identified culturally as Greeks or whatever specific region in the Mediterranean they were in at the moment, but they would have received that information and they would have caught on to the symbols because it was part of their history. It was part of their collective knowledge. But we have lost that in our modern context. And so we have misread and misinterpreted Revelation and missed the vision for discipleship that is there. And so when we are rediscovering our identity from cultural Christianity to Christ-centered discipleship, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the question of identity that is central to human life, but within Christianity, it has deep implications. What does it mean to be a Christian? Is it simply a label? Or is it a transformative identity grounded in community and discipleship? Reflecting on a quote from Lisa Fields that I had in some notes, because I've been thinking about some of this stuff for a while, and so I've got notes all over Evernote. And I wrote this down. Lisa Fields from the Jude 3 Project, she said, "Some millennials resent church because their parents were good at church but not good at life." Some millennials resent church. I'd say some Gen Xers too. Because their parents were good at church but not good at life. There are people who, I was looking at something also from the Jude 3 Project that was talking about what Gen Zers want their pastors to know. And one of the things was, you keep saying, let's do life together, but you're so far away from connecting with people. The community part of it. How do we go? And that's the challenge of the megachurch. And I get that. And I get we want to have more people in our churches and we want to evangelize and we want more people following Jesus. But if we fail at the group project that is discipleship, doing life together, then doing life together becomes a cliche for Christian satirists on Instagram reels. We're prompted to examine what it means to identify as a Christian versus embodying a Christian identity. The distinction is significant and it's pressing, especially as we confront the intertwining of cultural and political identities within Christianity. The people in your life right now are watching. We were talking about having a vision for discipleship, right? They are watching how you are handling this new political environment. They're watching how you're handling your economic status. They're watching and they're comparing it to the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, that's what young people, the number one complaint I see online with younger folks asking questions about the Bible and asking questions about Christianity is, I don't see it lining up with what I'm reading. And so there's this dissonance, right? And no, I'm not advocating for things like spiritual bypassing type of behavior or toxic positivity. I am advocating for discipleship based on truth, for spiritual formation based on truth. We just talked about, in the last few minutes, the Crusades. And how many of us were taught that the Crusades encompassed a couple of 100 years, maybe 3 at the top, at the most. But the Crusades were going on, the ideology around this holy war, this divine authority to wage war on people, which is so antithetical to the gospel, was still going on. Folks are looking at that and going, scratching their heads, trying to understand. Is it cultural or is it Christ-centered? What is your Christian identity based on? Jemar Tisby's reflection on the political alignment of white evangelicals raises key questions about identity within the church. He challenges us to consider why evangelical theology is so often aligned with conservative politics, whether this alignment reflects a cultural Christianity rather than a gospel-centered faith. Because statistics show that people wear the label of evangelical and haven't set foot in a church in like decades. So what does it mean to be evangelical? If we look up the definition of evangelical and we look at that, a lot of folks in a lot of Protestant traditions would be considered evangelical. When Christian, air quotes here, becomes a cultural badge, like Christendom in 1000 AD, like Christendom with the Crusades, when it becomes a cultural badge rather than a call to discipleship, it can reinforce cultural hierarchies and biases instead of transforming lives in the image of Christ. And that's what we've seen in history. That is why No More Silos exists, because I'm looking at the historical record. I've got the receipts. And what we've done in the Western church is reinforced cultural hierarchies and biases instead of transforming lives in the image of Christ. In large part. I mean, of course, there's pockets. I mean, someone discipled me, someone discipled you, maybe. The tension between a cultural Christian identity and a Christ-centered life is evident in the language used by public figures who identify as Christian. For instance, both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama spoke from a framework that often emphasized cultural Christianity. But what does this language reveal? Is it an authentic call to discipleship, or is it more reflective of a political and cultural affiliation that doesn't require tangible evidence of a Christ-centered life? The language of Christian identity versus identifying as a Christian is what we're talking about here. So this vision for discipleship that we see in Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses the language of Jewish identity. He addresses that. And then John addresses it in Revelation. He's saying, yeah, you talk the talk, but are you walking the walk? The language of Christian identity versus identifying as a Christian, George W. Bush communicated often from the point of view of Christian identity, whereas Obama communicated with the language of Christian identity. Depending upon where you stood and what kind of framework or filter you were hearing them through, you believed one was genuinely a Christian and one was not. Ironically, they're both Christians and both actually have tangible fruit in their lives that demonstrates their Christianity, even though their vocation is a political one. But the language is what mattered. So we have individualism and community in Christian identity. In Western culture, the notion of personal faith often leans towards an individual experience. This is something that shows up in America in the revival phase of the Great Awakening. That's the first time recorded history has this whole individual experience of faith. But the early church saw salvation as a communal experience, not an individual encounter. And the body of Christ is an interconnected whole. We are all called to grow together in faith, to serve one another, and to reflect Christ as a community. In our modern society, we often approach church as a team in the competitive sense, though, where leaving or joining a church is akin to switching sides. I saw online this afternoon that a church is literally hosting a class on how to deal with church hurt, because we created this team competition between churches when really we're all in this together. Yet this individualistic mindset conflicts with the scriptural call to unity in passage like Colossians chapter 3 and James chapter 2, which emphasize that in Christ, cultural backgrounds and hierarchies fade away. Our language also reflects this divide. For instance, English lacks the plural you that other languages possess, making it challenging for us to see biblical calls to quote unquote you as collective rather than personal. Such linguistic limitations can lead us to misunderstand passages meant to unify us as a community, reinforcing the idea of personal faith over communal discipleship. Is our vision for discipleship protecting authority or protecting power? The defense of the Bible's authority has long been a strategy of protection, especially within evangelical circles, where doctrines like inerrancy are upheld as safeguards against relativism. Yet, theologians like Angela Parker challenge us to consider what and whom these strategies actually protect. Do they safeguard the biblical text, or do they often serve to maintain power structures within the church? If God is indeed all powerful, as Parker asserts, does he need protection? Does he call us to embody the truths of Scripture, even when it means dismantling cultural hierarchies? I mean, this is the filter, this is the lens through which we look back at the Crusades and scratch our heads and go, what was that about? Breaking down cultural hierarchy in the church. In passages like Colossians 3 and James 2, the Bible speaks clearly about this. That within the community of faith, favoritism, discrimination, and hierarchy are not only discouraged, they are condemned as obstacles to genuine Christian unity. In a church that embraces cultural hierarchy, we risk alienating individuals who view the gospel as a pathway to transformation, not an endorsement of social status or political alignment. To untangle cultural Christianity from gospel-centered discipleship, we must encourage a shift in how we view the church, not as a competitive team, but as a temple of the Holy Spirit, a sacred community where our shared identity supersedes all cultural distinctions. We are the temple. The Bible Project has a great video explaining the significance of the temple in the Old Testament and its relevance even in the New Testament, and how when the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, it was like, well, now what? People were lost because they were looking for this building. And during the pandemic, especially during the lockdowns, the issue was, we were all online going, hey, the church is not a building. You don't need to go to church. But that really messed with the heads of a lot of folks because we thought church was an event. Church was this thing I went to, this place I went to, because it had changed over the centuries. And so we're now in a position where we have to untangle the cultural Christianity from gospel-centered discipleship. We must encourage this shift in how we view the church to a Christ-centered discipleship. So at the heart of authentic Christian identity is the call to discipleship, a call to be transformed, to serve, and to witness faithfully to Christ's message. This identity is marked by evidence of the fruit of the Spirit. It's marked by the evidence of communal worship. It is marked by the evidence of a commitment to live out the teachings of Jesus. And the issue is not merely about claiming Christianity, but about living as Christ's disciple. It's our way, practicing the way. It's a way of life. It's a way of living where actions mirror beliefs and private lives, align with our public witness. And that is what is missing in a lot of our spaces right now. As Fields noted, this distinction can be stark, especially for those who experienced a faith that was strong in ritual, but weak in transformation. Another article that I read a while back, and it was in my notes on Christian hypocrisy, highlights this disparity as well. I mean, it's often highlighted. Anybody that talks about church hurt or why they don't go to church anymore, it's usually this disconnect between the ritual and the transformed lives. But what challenges me as a believer is that sometimes the people that are highlighting this disparity profess a belief in Christianity, but as you continue to read what they're writing, it reflects more of a cultural association than a lived faith, raising questions about how the church can support those who are culturally affiliated with Christianity yet lack discipleship. I mean, seriously, it makes me sit there and go, you're not even arguing against actual Christianity. You're arguing against cultural Christianity. And those are not the same thing. So what does it look like to move towards a Christ-centered community? Well, in addressing the complexities of our identity, our Christian identity, we are called to examine our motivations. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot as we've been discussing, or as we've discussed, and as we will continue to discuss, even in today's episode, the Sermon on the Mount. What is our motivation? Jesus calls us to that, to ask that question, to examine our motivation, to examine our allegiances, to examine the depth of our commitment to his teachings. Are we living off inherited beliefs, or are we genuinely embodying the gospel's transformative power? Our identity in Christ goes beyond political affiliations and cultural ties. It's a radical reorientation of life centered on communal worship, sacrificial love, and steadfast discipleship. So here's my question for reflection that I want you to think about today. Who taught you about the authority of the Bible, and how has that shaped your identity as a Christian? Who taught you about the authority of the Bible, and how has that shaped your identity as a Christian? What does your life reveal about the source of your faith? A lot of folks have said in the last few weeks, hey, it's the economy. People are concerned eggs cost too much. Yeah, they do. I mean, I literally went to the store the other day and my daughter said, I want a apple pie. And I'm sitting there going, okay, I'm trying to think of things to keep her off her phone. And I'm like, well, let's make an apple pie instead of buying this $7 apple pie at the supermarket that was in the bakery. And we literally walked around the supermarket and I'm gathering the things to make a very simple apple pie, like go get the can of apple pie filling. And that was $4. And then I was like, okay, and the only other thing we need that we don't already have at home, because we have the rest of the ingredients I would need, is pie crust. So we go to the frozen food area and I'm like, pick up one of those frozen pie crusts. That was like $4 too, for two of them. And I'm sitting there going, well, shoot, it's $8 to make a pie that's not even making a good pie. And it's $7 to buy the one that's already made in the bakery. You know what we did? We went back and we bought the one in the bakery, because even that $1 we need. So I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, I'm that person. But when we think about the transformative power of God, of Christ, we have to reorient our life around Him. Who's our source? Our source is Jesus. And yeah, I probably could have insisted that no, we'll suck it up and deal with the dollar. But I'm also trying to teach her to be economically aware and frugal. And it was like, sometimes you just buy what's already baked. But was that the best decision? I don't know. Now that I say it out loud, as we strive toward an authentic Christ-centered identity, I hope that we can seek to embody the unity and the love and the witness that Scripture calls us to, living as disciples who faithfully reflect Christ's transformative power in both word and deed. And so in our next episode, because I'm trying to hold to a time limit on these episodes, so we're almost to the 40-minute mark, which is what I was going for. In our next episode, I want us to look at the words of Jesus and the warnings of John that can point us in the right direction for spiritual formation and discipleship. I know a few episodes back, I was like, I'm going to make this an online course, and I'm still going to do that. But there's a lot that's kind of under the surface that may not make it into the course. And I wanted to make sure that we expounded upon that as only we can here on No More Silos, looking at all of the angles of history and cultural context and the problems with interpretation that show up sometimes. So we're going to look at the words of Jesus and the warnings of John in our next episode as we continue talking about a vision for discipleship. And we'll cover that in our next episode with the Sermon on the Mount and Revelation. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that these episodes reflecting on Revelation, reflecting on studying Revelation are timely for you. I hope that they're a blessing for you. I hope that they educate you and do more than just inform, but transform your thoughts and your mind, renewing it as Paul has invited us to in his letter to the church at Rome. So my name's Erica. Thanks for joining me. Follow at Cultural Christianity on Instagram. Leave a review, a comment. Hey, I really like this on your podcast application so others can find it. Share this episode with others, and also join our Patreon page, No More Silos Podcast. No More Silos Podcast on Patreon, because that's where the video lessons are going to end up once I record them. Thanks for joining me, and have a fantastic rest of your day.